What's up, squad? This is Brandon from the Bantu Sun. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, I wanted to touch base on this latest program by President Trump, this proposal to issue basically residency status based on a refugee categorization for white South Africans, basically allowing white South Africans to come to America under the umbrella of recognizing them as refugees. All of this in a response to some threats from South African politicians on their desire for land seizures. So it's really two aspects I want to dive into this one. The first aspect, of course, is just this is probably one of the most racist, blunt acts I've ever seen of American president as far as rhetoric goes, due to its novelty. Like Blaney saying, it is so many horrible situations in this world, right? And we don't have to go to the world. We can just go to Africa. What's been done to Sudan has absolutely been horrendous. Sudan has already lost southern Sudan due to strife and warfare and prejudice amongst its populations. There has been all types of what many would say war acts um, that has been occurring in the Darfur region in the western Sudan, as well as just the blatant destruction of Sudan, especially Khartoum, due to the war between RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and then the government forces of Sudan. And a lot of people believe this is really being pushed or supported by outside forces, as many things in Africa. And that the population has seen nothing but tragedy. And to hop over this conflict or some of the other various conflicts that are going on the continent, you have ISIS in Mozambique, you have Boko Haram in Nigeria, you have so many other things going on in Africa. And here you go with South Africa, which is it nice? No. Is it pleasant? No. Is it neighborly? No. That these South African politicians keep making these threats in a cheap way to garner support and basically deriding white South Africans. Is that right? No, I'm not saying that's right. But for the president to jump over, a president who has never visited Africa, by the way, a president who has already said that he believes pretty much that there are shithole countries. If you believe in shithole countries, you believe in shithole cultures, and you believe in shithole people. Like, so it all one and the same. So this is a president has asserted he feels this way about countries. And some of those countries he put under the umbrella, I assure you, a lot of them will fall under Africa. And like I said, that's been made relevant by his lack of appreciation or his lack of care, his apathy for the continent. And all he hear white people threats. Hey guys, here go a refugee visa. I thought that was kind of like tacky, but I understand. Like this is their president, right? I think I saw something that was like white males voted for Trump. If you just had white males who voted for Trump, it would pretty much be the entire United States. He would have won, except like I don't know, like 3 to 5 states. So I'm not saying anything against that because hey, this is their president. They voted for this guy, but to call it anything other than what it is, a supremacist move or a racially motivated move, I think is wrong. This has nothing to do with the plight of the white South African within Africa. So yeah, we'll see where it goes, but I just thought that was really tart. Now there's been way worse programs given to Africa. It's like that's what I'm saying. Like this program, it's really not harmful to uh, Africans in the continent or abroad. It's just more disrespectful. There have been way more programs like welfare, for instance, that have done a lot more to destroy um, and erode African culture on the continent and abroad than like aid programs, etc., that have done a lot more practically to destroy Africans and on the continent and abroad than this. But it was just more of like, come on, really? Do it have to be this public? Do it have to be this vindictive? It was just so unnecessary. But I also understand that this is their president. When I say their, I mean white South Africans included. Like this is their president, and he's sticking up for his supporters. So this is the legacy he wants. So of course I'm gonna have grief with it, and they're probably over the moon with it. The second thing I wanted to talk about was, but I did want to say this, that really set a precedent. It really set a precedent as far as foreign policy with an American president in 2025 pursuing this method of thought, this method of communication. His words and actions have great consequence, as he already know, and I think that is him sending a blatant message not only to his supporters but also people who stands on the other side of the aisle from him. The second thing I want to talk about, and this is what's really more important, is the relationship of Africans to the world. Like, I've never been a really big on criticizing white South Africans. I find it to be a repugnant act. The reason why I find it to be a repugnant act, did white South Africans do a lot of repressive things? Of course, of course. Was apartheid South Africa heinous? Of course it was. The point of the matter is, it is 2025, and a lot of these politicians, South Africa is just indicative of many politicians in developing worlds, even politicians in America and African American communities. It's representative of many politicians that, in order to gain popular support, they go to the people and say, "We're not messing up. You're not messing up. It's what these people did to us." It's this dog whistle, as they say. It's just a way of identity politics, because they're the majority. The blacks are the majority in South Africa. So, of course, you win the blacks over, you win elections. And the way you win over blacks is at the expense of whites for some politicians. And they'll say, oh, it's their fault. And like, there is a ridiculous number. I believe it's about 7% of South African population is considered white South Africans. I hate using colors to describe people, but these are Africana or English speaking European descendants in South Africa, for succinct purposes, white South Africans, and they own about 70%, right? So it's like a 1 to 10, like 70%, 70 to 80% of the private property within the country. And this is a great disparity. And the reason why is, it's not unnatural that this has occurred. What is unnatural is its persistence to occur. Understood? So there were probably no private property rights. People don't understand this. They just see white people in South Africa. And that's one of the great things about this is why you have to understand geopolitics. This is why you have to understand history. They see white people in South Africa and they think that the South African story is the same as, say, the American story. And it's completely different. It's completely different in many facades. But they see black, white, and they make assumptions. The way South Africa was established was, first you gotta understand, a lot of Africa weren't coastal people. Coastal people are coastal because of sea trade, right? They moved to the coast because it's easier to ship goods out to the sea and receive them in. If you're not big on international trade, why would you live on the coast? So you'll see coastal cities in major cities in the world are going to be on the coast in some harbor or some port because there are the nexus, the centers of trade. Well, sub-Saharan Africa, especially outside of the East Coast, which got to be international trade through their exposure through the Indian Ocean trade and Arab countries, but especially like Western Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Africa, a lot of people that live on the coast. And what you have is the Europeans, when they were blocked off from Asian trade due to their Ottomans, they circled around the Cape of Good Hope back then. Firstly, it's Vasco da Gama in the 1490s, but late 1480s or 1490s, I believe. And the Dutch eventually took things over. There was a bunch of imperial wars, etc., but the Dutch took things over. Hence why Afrikaners is strongly influenced by Dutch language. But they set up trade in this port as a way station between the Netherlands and Europe, and the Netherlands prized colonies of the Dutch East Indies, nowadays Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And this colony kind of grew out. And then eventually in 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, the British and Dutch have wars, and then the British bring their crew in there. All this to say that for sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa is extremely diverse from people from various other countries because it was the center of empires that brought in a large influx. I have great relationships with a great affinity and acquaintance with this culture for many reasons of South Africa. I have great love for South Africa. And I know that South Africa is heavily influenced by a lot of outside things, Indian culture, Malay culture. From the Dutch East Indies, you have Islam. Um, it was a lot of Europeans, of course, the subcontinent, India, in various parts of other various parts of Africa as well. Some Saharan Africans were shipped to South Africa for work. So it is what I'm basically saying is that these Europeans created this structure that wasn't there before. It's obvious it wasn't there before. These are parliamentary structures. This is property rights. This is not property rights. These are property rights within an understanding of courts from a European structure. I don't think it's absurd to say such a thing. It's just that what I'm basically saying. So they created this thing. So of course they would have a large percentage of it. But what happened was they created it to the exclusion of people who they sought to govern over. This is the problem. Like they seek to rule and have authority over people for which they do not want to give a fair share of the pie to. And that is the great issue is how do they bring people into the fold in an equal and fair way? And that's where white South Africans failed. And this is why their regime failed. But for anybody to think that white South Africans who have been in South Africa, as long as many African Americans have been in America, like for them to think these people have no roots to the land, like white South Africans, they fought the British and bore wars, and the British treated them harshly as well. It's not to say that there's no heroes and villains in this story. It's just people trying to do the best for themselves and their kind. And what you see is these people have lived there for centuries, and they did develop South Africa. South Africa was highly developed, and they marketed a lot of resources in South Africa, the Krugerrand being one. They created a lot of first open heart surgery. I have a whole documentary on South Africa on my YouTube channel. Please check it out. And I try to really break down the various facets of how South Africa developed to the country we currently see now. Now, the problem is now that the ANC is in charge, is they have to create results, and now they're realizing it's not that easy to provide food. The way the white South Africans did it, well, they just said, look, this is our economy, and we're just going to give the cream to the whites. We're going to give them preferential job treatment, preferential land treatment, etc. The ANC has to govern all of South Africa right now, right? So it was no problem under a bigoted apartheid system when poor blacks couldn't survive. They say, oh, it's racism. The whites take the good stuff for themselves. But the problem now is, in a black government system, they still have poor blacks. And these poor blacks were saying, hey, guys, we supported you. You said we were going to be better. Why are we still down here? And now the ANC has to produce results. And instead of having produced results, it's not to say that many blacks haven't risen up, but not as much that they believe should have risen up. Instead of them producing results at a certain level, they start talking rhetoric and saying, oh, it's because white people still got too much. Now, you can discuss how you want to, but like even that's doing the same thing the whites were doing. Because now you're saying we have to take from the whites and figure out a way of how to integrate the population for a more equal playing field. Or I always hate conversations where they talk about cutting the pie. I'm all about growing the pie, the economic pie. And I don't like conversations where they say, oh, for you to have, I have to take from this person. Because it does two things. It creates animosity between your own people, right? And it's a sense of theft on one side. And then you're also now that theft accompanied equal or opposite reaction. That theft is going to be accompanied by resentment. And this is the great question of South Africa: is how do you provide for all your people and everybody feels as though they got a fair shake? And it's hard to do that with identity politics. So it's going to be really interesting. It's interesting and absurd in so many ways and unfortunate. Despite all this, South Africa, for all intents and purposes, is a phenomenal country. And I think if South Africa, if they had done a better job with the peace, you got to understand South Africa was a nuclear power. It was a nuclear power. The whites in South Africa were actually fighting the whites of Europe. They were trying to maintain sovereignty because, so many people were like, hey, man, you guys are ridiculous. And they knew they were ridiculous. But because of this, they could either be rational or go absurd. And they decided first to go absurd. And they had a great emphasis on governance, oppression, but defense, science, mathematics. These were people that said, okay, we're going to go absurd, but if we're going to go absurd, we got to be held accountable. We're going to have to be great. And they really hunkered down in that. And they really did try to push the envelope. Eventually, the tide was too strong and they got overwhelmed, and they said, okay, guys, we got to get rational. We can't fight the world. And they came to their senses eventually. But the fact that it was a nuclear power and they got rid of their nuclear weapons when the blacks got in charge, I find it to be striking. For whatever reason, they regressed the country. They made the country more vulnerable. And I think if this rhetoric wasn't there, if there was more conciliation for what happened. I'm not saying anybody's happy about it. I'm not saying we can appreciate that we forgive anything. But what we can say is, let's stop the line right here. What's in the past, we'll deal with that when we deal with. But we would not step one iota backwards. Academically, scientifically, in a defense measure, as competency, we won't take a step backwards. How do we get our people to move forward together? I think that would have been a greater conversation. The stronger South Africa, you wouldn't have this chaos that's going on in the Congo. You would have this ridiculousness of ISIS operating in sub-Saharan Africa. You wouldn't have so many other things that we see that go wrong if there was a strong, capable South African partner on the continent. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below. Like, share, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Until next time, take care. Bantu up.